going to go ahead and get started. My name is Ron Bloomfield. I'm on staff here at the Historical Society. How many of you have never been in the museum before? Everybody's been here? Well, okay. You guys don't count. Well, actually, I guess technically you do. We always ask that before our presentations, so it's great to see familiar faces then. We are proud to have partnered with Katie Hinson from Michigan Sea Grant in work to put this event together as part of a much broader project that will help chronicle the sort of the remembrance, a 30-year remembrance of what we call the Great Flood. And there's other names I'm sure that people have for it as well, those of us that remember it. But we're also working with some folks from the College of Arts and Letters and the History Department at MSU to do oral histories and scan photographs and talk to you about what you might have, that sort of thing. And they're in the back. And we're roughly the first hour, we're going to have a couple of speakers talk a little bit about the historic part of it, and then a little bit about present day. And then after that, we will have they will be available. How do we want to work that? Well, we can talk about when we get to that point how we want to disperse. We have a couple of areas set up that you can chat with the folks from MSU. So I've introduced Katie. And Dave Maurer is going to be our first presenter, Dave Maurer from WSGW. So I guess I'll turn it over to, oh, I'm sorry, forgot about it. We are going to be sending around a sign-up sheet. We're not collecting information. This is just to prove that Katie's not spending, not treating herself to a nice lavish donut spread there. So
I got to prove I fed some actual people in order for us to pay for the food. So if you would please just sign up, you'll just keep me honest.
Which is a great turnout. Yes?
Have you signed up on all the boards already?
If you already signed up, you don't have to sign again.
Right.
But I think most people didn't sign.
Okay. All right. Without any further ado, Dave Maurer.
Thank you. And thank you, Ron. Appreciate it very much. I'm the program director for WSGW, AM and FM. And also, at the time that the flood occurred, I was a news director. In addition to being program director for the news talk stations we have a total of 5 stations that serve the market, and I'm the operations manager for all 5 of those radio stations, which include WSGW AM and FM, KISS 107.1 FM, 94.5 The Moose, and Mix 106.3. And I do news on 4 of those 5 stations. So we are at Alpha Media, that's our owner. We're doing some remodeling at our building, and it was quite timely that Katie called me and told me about this project because we were cleaning out some things as part of our renovation, and a lot of it was old media. We don't use cassettes anymore, we don't use tapes anymore, we don't use reel-to-reel. Fortunately, I had some of those things, and going through that box when she called, I found my morning newscast from September 10th of 1986. So I thought we would begin. I'm going to play a 5-minute newscast for you that should give you a pretty good sense and feel of what was going on that first morning. The rain started heavily on the night of the 9th, continued into the 10th, 11th, and on into the 12th. So we'll see how this goes here.
It's 63 degrees at 6:05. Look for it to be mostly cloudy today, breezy and mild with periods of showers and thunderstorms again today, and a high of 73 degrees. We have a flash flood watch in effect. In fact, we're getting some local flooding in the Saginaw County area primarily at this time, and a number of school closings have occurred this morning. The Birch Run area schools are closed, Buena Vista schools are closed, Carlton schools, including St. Joseph's, Hemlock schools are closed, Valley Lutheran High School is closed, and Jesse Rouse Elementary School in Saginaw is closed, but the staff is to report. WSGW's Jim Alexander has the latest in road closings.
Here's a partial list of roadways that are closed or washed out from authorities in the area. Most roads are flooded in the area, according to state police at Bridgeport. I-75 southbound is closed north of M46. I-675 is closed. Saginaw police say that it's bad around the Children's Zoo area. That's Washington Street. The northwest corner of Saginaw is underwater. That's Bay at Davenport. The outer drive area is closed. The Holland Underpass is underwater. Dixie Highway being the only way out at this time, according to Saginaw authorities. Saginaw County Sheriff's Department reports that North Hemlock Road, the 1000 block is closed. Frost Road, 16,000 block has high water. There's a washout in the Birch Run area, Courtney near Moorish. Saginaw Township and Buena Vista Township, several basements have caved in, and the entire area underwater. State and Bay partially flooded as well, with cars half underwater throughout the entire area. Also, Bay City State Police saying that flooding is occurring throughout that entire area as well. Authorities all say to stay off the roads unless you must travel. That's a partial list of the road closings, and we'll keep you updated.
And over at the Sheridan in Saginaw Township, some people are being awakened this morning for their safety. A report on that from Ryan Reed.
Dave, indeed they are. It's a rude awakening. They're trying to evacuate the total first floor of the Fashion Square Sheridan, moving people up to the second and other floors, getting away from the water. I just got done being outside with one of the Saginaw Township firefighters that's on the scene. He says if you can tell anybody anything, have them stay off the roads, period. And from this area, you can certainly say that it's not safe to drive. Tittabawassee Road, part of Fashion Square Center, is all rain covered. It's at least 4 to 5 feet deep in some areas. The word right now in Saginaw Township and Tittabawassee Road, I-675 and I-75, is if you do not have to drive, don't. From Fashion Square Center, Ryan Reed, WSGW News.
And speaking of flooded cars this morning, a member of our news crew, one of those stranded from high waters, drowning out an engine. Here's Bill Hewitt live from Midland.
Well, Dave, I went along. There are several Midland City police cars, a Midland County EMS unit, a patrol car from the Sheriff's Department, and a fire rescue truck. All have trouble with the high water over here in Midland. High winds and high water, that's the best way to describe it. In the Four Seasons Trailer Campground behind Valley Plaza at the city of Midland, city limits where it joins Bay County, at least 4 trailers were tipped over by the winds right around 3 o'clock this morning. There are reports of several injuries where I've been unable to confirm any at this point. Again, the situation, the waters are starting to go down somewhat in Midland. Water as much as a foot deep on some roads, tied up traffic. Bay City Road, Austin, Patrick, in the city of Midland on the east side are flooded and barricaded. You cannot get through. Other roads throughout the city are also flooded. There's troubles with telephone lines and power outages as well in Midland. And that's pretty much the situation all over the Tri-County area. Reporting live from Midland, I'm Bill Hewitt.
Carlton Township officials are asking people to cut back as much as possible on water usage. Sandbagging has started in some areas. Consumers Power is being sieged by telephone calls. Spokesman Tim Patrigas says crews have been out all night responding to emergency calls for natural gas and electricity problems. If you see any down power lines, stay away and report them to authorities. Should you smell gas in your home, turn the gas off if possible. If you cannot reach the source of the gas, turn off all appliances at the breaker. Should the gas leak continue, evacuate. Saginaw Township Fire Crews and Rescue Units were at 2810 Ashton within the past hour. A call indicated a basement wall in the home had collapsed and the water-soaked ground was threatening to take more of the house's foundation down. Consumers Power called to the scene to monitor utilities to the residents. We're told there are many people with flooded basements this morning. Authorities say at least 2 people died and 6 were injured as severe thunderstorms swept through southern Michigan, packing a tornado, heavy rain, and high winds last night and this morning. The storms caused flash floods and damage from Muskegon to suburban Detroit. Authorities say a lightning strike last night killed 18-year-old Amanda Burkholder of Stanton and injured 2 siblings, while lightning injured 2 teenagers inside a Muskegon County church. A 50-year-old Otsego woman died when a tree fell on her car, and Gratiot County authorities say an Owasso couple were injured in a car accident caused by high water.
We had one couple locally that were down in the Bridgeport area that were killed in floodwaters. They were just bystanders looking at the waters, and they lost their lives as a result of that storm. In addition to the Sheraton being flooded, just some observations that I made in going back and forth to work and covering it as well. The former Hojo's, Howard Johnson's Motor Lodge, I believe it was known at the time as a Creekside Inn at M84 and I-75, also was underwater on its first floor, and the cars that were out in the parking lot had water up to their rooftops. There's just a lot of water that came in through that area, and the flooding continued on through there. There's a creek that runs behind there and goes behind St. Paul's Church, and part of the cemetery was flooded as well as a result of that. Veterans Memorial Park here in Bay City was heavily flooded. The Sears lot, that's Horax now, was halfway up their parking lot. The water was that high. The underpass that ran underneath the The bridge at that time was completely underwater. James Clements Airport was underwater, several feet of water all over the airport. The Midland Daily News was flooded. They're on McDonald Street in Midland, and their lower level. The waters came up, flooded over the top of the Tridge and all that area down along the river. It flooded into the courthouse and also affected the Daily News. And all of these yawning ditches that we have around here, you've seen a lot of those driving. They go, oh my gosh, I don't want to run off the road into one of those. Well, you couldn't see them because they were completely filled, and water was over the road, and you were taking your life in your hands if you drove down some of those roads that had that much water, not only in the fields but in the ditches and on the roads. You also had to plot your route on where you wanted to go. You heard on the report that Dixie Highway was the only way out of Saginaw at one particular time there, and you had to think about how you're going to get from here to there with all the water. You heard Bill Hewitt mentioning from Midland that he drowned out a news car. That was one of 3 vehicles that we lost. The second one that occurred is this one. This was our older remote van and used by our engineer. You can see water up to the passenger compartment. He was trying to go to the transmitter site, and that's a story in its own that I'm going to tell you about. And then we had another van, a newer van. Someone was smart enough to stop and not drive through the water here on Portsmouth Road out in some of the flooded areas. But Bill and his Ertz, to cover all of the news, managed to flood this van as well. So we had 2 vans and a news car that went under. I'll pass these around if you'd like to take a look at them. The second morning, the morning of September 11th, I got a call about 2 o'clock in the morning from our person who was on duty at night, telling me that the radio station, the AM, was off the air, that the transmitter site was flooded. Our engineer was out there stranded, and as it turns out, our general manager and the operations manager, who has the title I have now, were both in New Orleans for a convention for 3 days. So there was no one here to make the decisions. So they decided to call the news director and have the news director figure out what to do. So first thing I did is I grabbed a roll of visqueen plastic from home. I grabbed an extra sump pump that I had at home, and headed down to the station to find out just what the circumstances were. I talked to the engineer and found out, as you'll see this one vehicle, that he had water that was up over his waist. We had about 2 feet that was inside our transmitter building and had knocked us off the air. That transmitter building is located along M81 in Indiantown. There's a 6-tower array out there, that's ours, and that's where the building is. It's on Uncle Henry Road, and it sits back about a quarter of a mile off the road. And the dike broke, and that's what caused it to get flooded out there. So first thing I wanted to do was, well, we have to stop the water, and we've got to get the water out of the building. We've got to dry out the transmitter. That's why I brought along a hydraulic jack with me. But first I made a few phone calls from the station after I found my way there through all of the detours. And I called Emergency Operations Center in Saginaw, and I told them I needed some sandbags. And they said, I'm sorry, we can't help you with any sandbags. And I thought, well, what a fix. Well, I need some sandbags. So I called back and I said, look, I'm in the communications business. We've got to get a radio station back on the air so we can tell people what they need to do for the next couple of days with this flooding. And the gentleman said, well, I can provide you with some empty sandbags. And we have someone here from the city of Zilwaukee. They have their yard. You can go down to the city of Zilwaukee yard and you can fill the sandbags on your own if you like. So while we weren't on the air, so I grabbed some of my reporters and a couple of news cars, and we went down to the Zilwaukee yard, and we had a shovel, and we filled sandbags, loaded up both news cars, the trunk and back seat full of sandbags, drove back to the station, and I knew those news cars weren't going to do any good to get it in where I needed it. So I thought, well, how can I get a hold of someone with a high-profile vehicle that can carry all this sand in for me? Well, there was a gentleman in Bay City at the time who would do just about anything for anybody, and I called him in the middle of the night. His name's Frank Recksteiner, and I asked Frank if he could come out with a truck. And he didn't come personally, but he sent someone out with a truck. And so at the radio station, we loaded all the sandbags from the news cars into the back of his truck and went out to the transmitter site. And he drove in as far as he could, but he couldn't get beyond our remote vehicle that you see there that's flooded. The road was blocked, so about half the distance, about 1/8 of a mile, My reporters and I were up to our waist, and we were carrying sandbags on our shoulders from the truck, carrying it into the transmitter building. So I took the plastic, put it around the two doors that are on there, and we put sandbags around the doors. And then we got inside and we started turning on the pump. And that one sump pump wasn't making a lot of progress against about 2 feet of water that was inside this building. That is probably not quite the size of this room, about 3/4 of the size of this room. So as the day went along, when business hours were open, I called our business manager, and she called Wolf Isles and made arrangements to get me 5 more sump pumps and hose. And I had some of our people back at the station who were itching to help out grab a rowboat, and they brought a rowboat and the pumps, and they brought us some food and came out to the transmitter site. So we had 5 pumps working. Meanwhile, we loosened the bolts that anchor the transmitter, and we jacked the transmitter up and got it up out of the water so it could start drying out. And it took probably, and power was still on. We're messing around in this water with the electricity and everything and pumps, and I hate to think of the workman's comp, and probably there's some circumstances there that were kind of risky. But anyhow, we had that going on from the time we were able to get it going and start getting it pumped out in the morning, and it was late afternoon before we got the water out of the building and got it dry enough where we could, the transmitter was dried out enough, and there's still a couple inches of water, and there was one other reporter and myself still out there, and we got on top of a wooden desk while the engineer went over and threw the switch to turn on the transmitter. And he didn't get electrocuted, and we were pleased with that. And we got back on the air. But it was unfortunate, being the kind of station we are, to be off those hours, but what you heard here, we were able to get the first full day on there before this was the second morning when we got flooded out and knocked off the air. So we were able to get out a lot of emergency information to people and telling them where they could and couldn't go and what to expect. We were also putting information on one of our FM stations. We had an FM at the time, so we used the FM to get out information as well. The Saginaw River handles a lot of water. It drains 22 counties. There are 3 rivers that make up the Saginaw River. And most of you in your lifetime, you've seen when we get a northeaster here and there's maybe been a rainstorm or whatever, we've got water coming down the river, and you'll get a little, down the seawalls down here, will get up to the top of the seawalls along the river. There may be some low spots that will catch a little bit of water. But the Saginaw River, I've got a lot of respect for it. Over the last 30 years, I've never seen it ever come close to what we had when we had that flood in 1986. And it can handle a lot of water. And so it's a kind of a delayed reaction that we get right here in Bay City, because it takes a while for all that water to drain through all those other counties and get down here and come down the Saginaw. Well, that had the drain commissioner in Saginaw County quite nervous about what was going to happen. His name was Jim Koski. And Jim was studying flood maps and looking at everything and trying to figure out what was going to happen next. And he thought, with all the volume of water that was coming our way in Saginaw, that there was going to be a problem. So we were on the air appealing for volunteers on their behalf to come help fill sandbags. And they used sandbags and also dirt. They decided to use the railroad tracks that runs through Carlton and Zilwaukee as a line where they would try to hold back the floodwaters from the river. So they built a berm all the way along the river through Carlton and Zilwaukee and sandbagged in there to keep the water from going beyond. Because Jim had determined from the flood maps that if they didn't do something to stop the water, it was going to flood all of Carlton and Zilwaukee all the way up to I-675 before it would stop. So they were successful with what they did and with the way some of the waters went. Over that period of time, I don't have the exact figures in front of me, but it was between 10 and 11 inches of rain that we got in those short few days. We had already had previous rain in September and the ground was pretty much saturated. Then we got this deluge. It just parked over us and just stayed here and kept raining and raining and raining. And we got 10 or 11 inches before it finally subsided after the 12th and water started going down. I think overall, I don't have exact stats, but I believe overall we got about 19 inches of rain that September in 1986. So once we were back on the air, we were busy giving school closings, road closings, cancellations that were going on day after day, utilities, safety and sanitation messages. One thing that really impressed me in the days that followed, and how many you found to begin to see how many people were impacted when they started putting all the trash out at the curbs from their flooded basements and their homes. It was just, you know, the trash company, they earned their keep, that's for sure, in dealing with everything that was out there. And in many cases, people were fortunate where they might have just had storm water, but there are other people who had sewage that destroyed their homes, and it costs a lot of people a lot of money. In addition to that, there is enormous agricultural impact. This was a time of the year where some of the beans were off, but there were still beans in the field, there were beets in the field, there was corn in the fields, and there was enormous agricultural impact throughout this entire area. And Congressman Traxler organized a meeting. It was held at Reese High School, and there are other state and federal agencies involved, having an informational meeting on what they could do to help people. People wanted to know if they could get any relief and what was going to happen as a result. They did get some disaster loans available for agriculture, and there were some other types of help. But there were 3,000 people, according to our farm director, that turned out at that meeting at Reese High School to learn about what could be done in recovering from that flood. So it had a lot of impact. The biggest difference that we have between now, and I know Katie's going to address it, is the difference that we have technology between then and now. There's a lot of difference in what we're able to do for communication and what information that we can get out and how fast we can get it out, and notification systems that we have. I'll put a plug in for Bay Alerts. If you're not signed up for that, you should be. It's important to have if you have a smartphone or even on your home phone. If they've got a disaster going, and you can select the levels of notifications you want to get, but they will send you a message to let you know the circumstances that you've got. We set this up about 10 years ago, a system. We started out with pagers. We set up a system with central dispatches in Saginaw Bay and Midland counties. When they have something, they notify us. That's how when there's an accident at Jenny and Thomas, and or Jenny and Euclid, or Thomas and Euclid, and you hear us on the air, we get it instantaneously. They put it out right away for us so we can tell people to stay away from that intersection or whatever. It works quite well when you've got individual accidents or fires and things. In the winter, when you get a bad storm and everything is shut down, they just stop giving. We just start using a blanket message: stay off the roads, don't drive. A lot of roads are impassable, and it becomes very generic at that point. And then they call us a few hours later and tell us they handled 110 accidents in Saginaw County, and 80 in Bay County, and 70 in Midland County. So that's how we get the information so quick. And also with the computers and social media. Social media would be fantastic in this day and age. We could have people sending us pictures of some of the damage and stuff. They become more or less reporters for us. I know TV uses it all the time, asking people to send in their pictures after storms. We're in the same boat. We have a website, and we have apps, and we put pictures and things on our website as well. So we could do a lot more. We could extend our resources just thanks to that technology and notification systems that we have here today. There are a lot of pros and cons on social media. What's put on there, we have no control over. We deal with that all the time. We have a monthly meeting with law enforcement and media and talk about different things. And one of the biggest problems we have is with social media, because people are putting false and erroneous information on there, and it gets around fast. And then the law enforcement has to deal with getting the correct information out through the proper channels to try to straighten things out so that people know what's going on. But I think I've pretty much exhausted my time, unless you have some questions afterward. You want to do questions now or later?
I think we can do questions now.
Do questions now? Okay, I see some people who were never even born at that time, and I see a lot of people who probably remember more than I do about the flood in the room. So I'd be more than glad to entertain a few questions and try to answer them. No questions? Well, they're going to ask you later if you have a story to tell. Maybe it won't be in front of a whole room, but they're going to ask you to share some information about your memories of the flood. This was a flood that was considered a 500-year flood. In other words, that's a storm that you would expect to see occur in an area once in 500 years. Initially, they considered a 100-year flood, and as time went by and it got so much worse and impacted so many more people, they determined it was a 500-year flood. Thank you very much.
So Dave did a fantastic job of covering kind of the history of the 1986 storm, and I'm going to bring us a little bit more into the present today and talk about 30 years later, some of the things that have changed since then, and some of the ways in which it's still really important that we be preparing for flooding. So my name is Katie Hinson. I'm an extension educator with the Michigan Sea Grant program in the Saginaw Bay area. And I've been kind of leading some of the effort on this 1986 commemoration project. Yeah, all right. So, one of the questions I get a lot when I talk to people about 1986 is if it could happen again. And so I have this no ... That's a big caveat. In some ways, the answer is no, that we probably, if we had a flood of the same magnitude as 1986, it probably wouldn't have the same level of damage today, because we've made so many advancements in predicting storms and flooding, and because we have so many new technologies for communicating with residents during an emergency. So that means that we would have more advanced notice, we would have more accurate information in the case of a flood, and that will really reduce the kind of damage that you see. So in 1986, we didn't really have information about our local river tributaries. It was really hard to accurately predict what would be the peak crest for places like the tributaries off of the Tittabawassee and the Saginaw River. Now we have automated river gauges that are placed in all of the rivers that are transmitting information about how high the rivers are all the time. And you can actually go online and see it in real time. So with the proliferation of the internet, it means that not only do local public officials have a lot more access to know what stage the rivers are at, but the public can as well. So this is a shot I took today off of the National Weather Service website. Every one of those dots is a river gauge in Michigan, and it's recording in real time what's the level of the river. Green means it's not a flood, so we're good today. And then you can click on your river in your local area, so that bottom right-hand corner shot is from the Saginaw River at Saginaw, and you can see what the level of the river is, and you can watch it as it goes up into areas of higher and higher flood risk. So this is a level of information that we had nowhere near in 1986. I was alive in 1986. Barely, but.
Local official at the time.
I was not a local official. We also have a lot better communication between local agencies, first responders, federal agencies, and the public. So we already talked about some of those push notifications you can get on your phone or on your email, where you can get automatic updates when there's a flood warning. You can see when there's flooding in your neighborhood, when there's roads closed. You can get that information a lot more quickly. Another big change from 1986 flood is the way that we think about how we plan our communities in the Saginaw Bay region. So the 1986 flood, I think for a lot of public officials, was a big wake-up call. We heard lots of stories of folks at the radio station kind of banding together to stop the floodwaters, and I think the same thing happened at communities all over the area. And as a result, after the flood, a lot of the communities that were most heavily impacted, places like Vassar or Midland, started to change their building patterns. They started to think, okay, maybe we shouldn't rebuild our houses and our businesses in the same spot where we had such a devastating flood. Instead, we should put a baseball field or a park or a parking lot there. So you can see this is a view of downtown Midland in September of 1986 and this month. And you can tell some of these buildings down in the bottom corner are no longer there, right? They've replaced them with parkland and parking lot. So if we had the same magnitude of flood today, you'd get a lot less damage because it wouldn't impact quite as many residents or businesses. So, could 1986 happen again? In some ways, no, but also definitely yes. So, we've made a lot of advancements in technology and information, but all that does is give us the ability to have more advanced warning, basically. It increases our chances to act quickly, to minimize damage. It doesn't do anything to decrease the likelihood that we would have another storm of that magnitude, right? So, in fact, we're finding that we're actually seeing a pattern of increased frequency and intensity of storms over the last few decades. So this is some data from the National Climate Data Center as part of the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. And what it shows is basically that over the last 50 years, we've seen a 37% increase in the amount of rain or snow that's falling in the biggest storms. So these big storms are happening more frequently, which makes it just as important that we continue to prepare for another storm like 1986. This is just to show that, 1986 was not the first storm of its kind. It was maybe bigger than some of the ones we've seen in the past, but we are not strangers to large storms in the Saginaw Bay watershed. We had some pretty major flooding in 1904, in 1912, in 1916, in 47, and again in 86. And I would probably add to this list 2013 in Saginaw. They had some other big flood events. So we live in a part of the state where we just have flooding pretty regularly. So that's part of why it's important to kind of take proactive measures to reduce the damage to your property and to the people that you care about. So, how can you do that? My notes are kind of cumbersome, I apologize. All right, so there's some really easy steps. I'm going to talk about the two most critical things you can do to reduce damage to your family and to your property. The first is to make a plan. It's really easy. You just sit down and think about, in one page, answering these questions. How do you get information about a coming flood? Have you signed up for Bay Alerts? Have you signed up for the National Weather Service notification system? Do you listen to the radio regularly? Do you have television? How are you going to get your information about flood? Is your home, your business, your school in a flood-prone area? It's really easy now to go online and look up the FEMA Flood Map Service Center, and you can put in your address and it'll tell you whether or not your address is in a floodplain, which means it's pretty likely to flood. We don't build a lot of stuff in the floodplain anymore, but you can see how close you are to those areas. Let's see, how would you learn about evacuation orders? How would you get that information? Your local emergency management office is usually going to be putting out reminders, but thinking about how would you have access to know when there's actually an evacuation order in place. What access roads can you use to evacuate? We heard, on that old radio program just how many roads were out of commission. So if you don't have your Google Maps and all of the roads are flooded, do you know how to get out of where you're at? Does your teenage kid know, right? So just thinking about that ahead of time can make a really big difference when you're in the moment and there's actual danger happening. And then the last thing is to just kind of think about, as a family or as a household, where would you meet if you're separated during a flood event? If your cell phone's not working, if your internet's not working, if the electricity is down, is everybody just gonna run around like a chicken with their head cut off? Like thinking about a central point where your family can go be located. Some really easy stuff to do. And then the second thing you can do is build an emergency kit. So just kind of putting together all of the materials that you might need if you were stuck in your house or stuck in your office during a flood. And I think we probably had lots of stories of people who were stuck in their houses during 1986 and didn't have things like fresh water or food. And some really basic things to include in that, just to have it on the ready. So things like supplies of non-perishable foods, of bottled water, battery-operated radios, flashlights, having kind of your personal items there, medication, thinking about your pets, how are you gonna get your dog out, where are you gonna put your dog if there's a flood, that kind of stuff. So, and then the last thing I have here is just kind of a list of other resources. This is from the Chippewa Nature Center, a lovely, he looks like he's in the 70s, but 80s guy in a canoe. There's a lot of really good resources out there, and we've put together a website in connection with this project called 1986flood.com. And that's a place you can go. You can see photos that people have submitted of the flooding. You can write up a little story and click submit and have your story added to the map. And also we have a lot of these resources about kind of what you can do to prepare for future floods. I also have a bunch of resources on this table over here. If anybody is interested, you can snag some of those. So with that, I'm not going to take a ton more time, but if anybody has questions for me or Dave, we'd be happy to hear them. Yes?
I got a comment. The NOAA map that you showed up there, or for the Saginaw River, I live in Midland, and in 3 years ago when you had flooding in Saginaw, Midland had extensive flooding as well. And originally, when it started, they started predicting it because they have computer modeling that tries to, and they were saying 34 feet, which was the same as 1986. So you can imagine my house actually got, maybe a foot of water in 1986. So I was a little concerned. Well, they were able to do a few things. They started, I think, dumping the lakes upstream ahead of time. They were proactive, which meant that, things were gonna flood faster, that were gonna flood. But they redid the modeling and they said it was 30 feet, so I felt a little better about that, And then we didn't quite get the rain that we were supposed to. And so by Wednesday, they predicted, the modeling said it was gonna peak crest at midnight Saturday at 28.5 feet. On that, what you just showed there. It crested at midnight, 28.37 feet. It was amazing that the modeling was that accurate. And really, they saved a lot of homes by what they did. So you're right in that it could happen, but there are some things now that really have changed.
Yeah, absolutely. Any other questions or thoughts? All right. Cool. Well, with that, we have some folks here from Michigan State University, and they brought scanners. If you have any photos from the flood that you want to get put into a digital copy, we'll digitize them and give you a CD with the preserved photos, and then obviously your original photos. They also brought recording equipment if anybody wants to share their story from 1986 and have it archived here at the museum. So if you have any stories or memories that you want to share, you're welcome to kind of congregate at the back of the room. If not, you're welcome to head on out into the afternoon. But I think lots of people have good stories to share, and we would love to collect those from you for preservation. Anything else?